Hello, my name is Suzanne Evans and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. This is a podcast for people who are interested in creating change, whether that is within organisations or for individuals. In each podcast episode, I will have a conversation with someone about their work to share their story. Each story and conversation will provide you with ideas and inspiration for your own organisation or for you personally. To find out more about each episode, including further reading, and to share your change stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. My guest today is David Lee. Regular listeners of the podcast will know that David's been on here before. He actually was one of my very first episodes way back when this podcast started back in 2020. And David is an internationally recognised authority on the organisational and managerial practices that optimise employee performance. David is the author of Managing Employee Stress and Safety and Storytelling for Trainers, as well as nearly 100 articles and book chapters on employee and organisational performance that have been published all around the world. I actually recorded this podcast episode with David in a webinar format, so there's video as well. That's available on the YouTube site. But it was such a great conversation. I so enjoyed it. I've had lots of lovely feedback on people watching it and that they enjoyed it too. So I thought I'd have it as an episode of the podcast here so that people who prefer to listen to their podcast rather than watch can hear what David had to say. In this conversation, we were talking about all things storytelling and particularly storytelling with leaders. I hope you really enjoy it. Hi, so I'm here today with David Lee, and we're going to be talking about storytelling for leaders. David, thank you for joining me on this podcast today, webinar.
Oh, great to get together again.
As always, we have loads to talk about. When we first started talking about this in terms of how leaders could be more effective at using storytelling in their practice, we had lots of ideas and tips and techniques that we could give to people. But actually, just today, I've had an experience speaking to a senior leader in an organisation where they were saying they're finding so many of their people are feeling stressed and are coming into work already stressed by everything else that is going on in the world around them and the worries that they have in their personal lives. And this is making it challenging for them in this organisation to affect change because it's almost like people's cups are already full. There's so much uncertainty. What's your view on how leaders can deal with this current situation? What can they be doing to help people build their resilience and to deal with the uncertainty that they have in their personal life, but then also uncertainty at work as well?
Yeah, a topic near and dear to my heart. And
it's a big one.
It certainly is. And, so critical. Before I sort of launch into the storytelling part of this, I'd actually like to hearken back to your fantastic interview with Dr. Angus Fletcher. Mm-hmm. And I loved what the two of you were saying about how oftentimes when people think about storytelling, they think they have to be some amazing raconteur, or they think of it as a performance kind of thing. And I loved how Angus talked about, well, first it's about being a good listener. And so maybe the first thing for leaders to do is, instead of have you ever heard this term? I remember somebody describing somebody as they're always in broadcast mode, never in receive, like walkie-talkies or like over, And so it's so unfortunately natural for somebody in leadership to be, exhorting their people to, we can do this kind of thing. And probably the first thing to keep in mind is being a good listener to find out, what is going on with people and connect at that level. So to me, that's number one. And actually, before I go on, do you want to say anything about that? Because I know that's something that you both, know is really important.
This is one of my hobby horses in organisations, about how, particularly in the world of change, which is where I spend most of my time, organisation change and transformation, that the leader's role is so often seen as being someone who advocates for the change. So spends their whole time persuading people that this change is an excellent idea. and not enough time, and often not any time, actually going around the organisation and talking to people about what's going on for them, what's difficult for them, how this thing that's happening might help them deal with some of these problems in their work and their daily life. And that sort of activity seems to have fallen away. And so the leader is all about trying to persuade people to come on board with the change rather than listening to them and then making use of what they hear in talking about the change. I think Alan Arnett, my colleague, always talks about the shiny pen analogy and how the leader in change often tries to persuade people that they have to buy the shiny pen, the change is the shiny pen, whereas actually they haven't really discovered whether the person needs a pen or not. They just spend their whole time trying to sell them a nice new shiny pen. So yeah, absolutely agree. I think, is it Nancy Duart who talks about listening tours, that leaders should be going on listening tours around their organisation and just listening to the stories that are being told and what people are saying. So I absolutely agree that listening and taking notice of things is absolutely the right place to start before leaders even consider using stories or building their own practice as a storyteller.
Yeah, and actually, related to the listening tours, I remember this really interesting study that Peter Bregman told me about, where MBA students were asked, if you get hired to lead an organization, what is the first thing that you would do? And the majority of them talked about showing who's in charge, creating that vision, it's rallying the troops, et cetera. And then when the researchers interviewed employees of various organizations and they said, what would you like a new leader to do? Just as you said, is like conduct listening tours, like find out from us what's going on, our insights, our needs, et cetera. So, yeah.
But don't you think there's this kind of, in organizations and in leadership generally, there's this focus on activity and action, and often time taken to reflect or time taken to listen is seen by some leaders and the organisation that they are in is seen as wasted activity. If you look at people's diaries, it's just back-to-back meetings, Zoom meetings or face-to-face meetings. There's no time in the day for actually reflecting or going out there and talking to people. It's all just action, action, action. And I think the sort of that study you were saying about the leaders and MBA leaders is key there, that actually they were seeing that as their key activity. But, that's just not the case. It's not what makes a good leader.
Absolutely. And the sort of the myth of the heroic leader, that's the only way to lead. And actually one quick, hopefully this doesn't turn into being too tangential, because I know we want to talk about the resilience piece, but also when you talked about the time to reflect, that's, getting into kind of the nuts and bolts of being a great storyteller. One of the things that I'm always saying to clients is reflect on interesting experiences that happen to you throughout the day and capture those. And not that you can capture everything, but just those that really stood out for you, like, wow, I didn't see that coming, or that's an interesting reminder of, fill in the blank. And then curate those stories so you can draw on them later, because oftentimes, as I'm sure you've noticed, the most fascinating, useful stories are the most nuanced and subtle, which a day later or a week later, certainly a month later, you've long forgotten if you haven't curated them.
Definitely. And I think one of the first conversations I had with you when we very first met was about creating your story bank. And I've done that since then. I've recommended it to so many people. I always credit you, by the way. But, it's that idea of actually logging it, because how often when you think, oh, I've got a great story about this thing, if only I could remember what it is, how often does that happen? Whereas actually, if you start making a note of them as they happen to you, then it's far easier. And I think going back to what you were saying right at the beginning about this fear of people not wanting to engage with stories because they feel they're not a raconteur, they're not an entertainer, they're not a natural storyteller. I think having that structure around you, it takes away some of that nervousness. So you're not relying on being able to think on your feet in the moment. You actually have that around you so that you're making it easier for yourself to build storytelling into your practice.
Absolutely. And especially, for people who speak at events, conferences, at association meetings, presentations are so much more interesting and useful if they're based on stories, and it's really hard coming up with stories off the top of your head. So absolutely curating them.
So if we were trying to encourage leaders then to build more storytelling into their practice, how would we do it? What advice would you give to a leader who's embarking on this journey of trying to become more proficient at storytelling?
Yeah. So there are a couple of different things that I think about. In some ways, the hardest, I think, is taking the retrospective approach. And so thinking about what are those key moments of truth in my career, my leadership journey, my personal journey that have really impacted me. And one of the things I say to clients is it's not something you sit down with furrowed brow and then start typing away like this, and this. They come in dribs and drabs. And so maybe when you're working out, oh, right, that time when, or you're talking with somebody, they share a story about a formative experience they had with a supervisor. And you're like, oh, that reminds me of blah, blah, blah. And so retrospectively, what's way easier is priming your brain for moving forward to notice those. So being very present in the moment. So as I mentioned earlier, something you were surprised during the day, or you noticed how, let's say, a team member disagreed in a meeting, but they did it in a non-disagreeable way, in a way that really invited dialogue. And you're like, wow, I really like that. I'll give you a quick example. So I was, this hopefully will be an example of the difference between speaking abstractly, which I just did, and then using a story, which is concrete, which makes it much more understandable. So I've used this example a lot over the last few years. So I was working with a leadership team, and they were, brainstorming ideas for whatever it was. And one of the members of the leadership team said his idea. And the CEO, who's a really cool guy, but also a very matter of fact and can have kind of a poker face. And he asked the member of his team, I'll call it Joe. So he goes, I'm curious, Joe, how would that work? And then he caught himself and he said, I'm not asking you that because I don't think it's a good idea. I'm asking you because I'm really curious about that. And I thought, fantastic. Yeah. Isn't that neat? So he was very clear on his non-intention, I'm not asking you because I think it's a bad idea. And then he's very clear on his intention, I'm really genuinely curious. And you think about that little nuance, especially when somebody's in a position of power and or they have a strong personality or kind of a hard to read personality. It immediately lowers this, the anxiety level of the other person, oops, I said the wrong thing. So that's an example. I remember when it happened, I'm like, sweet, way to go. And make a note and I brought it up with that team over the years when we've talked about psychological safety. And I use it in other examples. So that's one very simple and really fruitful practice moving forward is just to notice those nuances and then again curate those. So those are a few things.
I love that. And I think that idea of noticing is so important for all of us. How often are we in any interaction thinking about what am I going to say next? What am I going to do next? What have I got for tea? All that sort of thing. And actually, I'm saying that because it's the afternoon here. But, it's being in the moment and being present, I think, is really important. And also that story speaks to me from another thing, which is another fear that I think gets in people's way, which is of getting things wrong and saying the wrong thing. And in that story, you illustrate that the leader realised they'd said something that could be construed wrongly, but then rescued the situation by noticing and commenting on it. And I think that's a really great illustration of the fact that you don't need to worry necessarily about getting things wrong, that even if you say something, it doesn't land right, or it wasn't what you intended, or it didn't have the right effect, it doesn't matter. You can rescue it. You can bring it back. Everyone is a human and everyone's enabled to make mistakes. And I think sometimes there's this kind of almost culture of perfection around leadership, which is what stops people from perhaps doing something different. And of course, for lots of people, storytelling is actually something that's different from what they're used to doing.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the areas where leaders can use stories as such a powerful bonding vehicle, is sharing their humanity, their bloopers, and always, thinking about, okay, is this appropriate, useful, etc., to give people permission to be honest about their own mistakes and their own foibles, and fostering, again, psychological safety. It's like, okay, it is okay to acknowledge you make mistakes and maybe you have fears, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a really important, domain of storytelling, I feel like, in leadership.
And I'm glad that you raised earlier this idea of a leadership journey, because often when I'm working with senior teams, they're trying to launch a new strategy. They want to do it differently, but they don't know how. They like the idea of telling a story of this new thing that's happening or the new world. But again, they don't know how. And I often get them to start thinking about their own story first, because it's easier for them to talk about what they did and how they got to where they are now, because it's something that they're familiar with. And I quite often use the work of Noel Tichy in the sort of teachable point of view thing. But I get them to think about the sort of, you said it earlier, but the kind of the key points, the key milestones, the key turning points in their life that got them to this point. And it's really interesting that the stories that emerge from that, the very best ones, don't follow this kind of linear, I did this, and I was successful at everything, and now look, here I am. The ones that everyone really likes are the ones where people went in the wrong direction, or something went really wrong, and then they recovered and they carried on. And I think that idea of vulnerability and of mistakes is really important, particularly for leaders talking to more junior, less experienced members of staff, because it just reassures them that no one's had this kind of stellar trajectory of I did this and now look at me, I'm the CEO. That just doesn't happen. There's lots of things that go wrong along the way. And I think, for me, if I was giving advice to anyone wanting to start thinking about storytelling, is start looking at your own story first, because we all know that's an easy subject to talk about. Everyone likes talking about themselves, right?
That's great.
Or is that just me?
I love it. That's awesome. Yeah. So a couple things. And there's also something I want to loop back to, the whole vulnerability and being a leader, that, yeah, especially for younger employees who, typically, and this is something I've heard over and over from interviewing younger employees, like, we've had our in childhood, everything was mapped out, and lots of coaching from parents and informal coaches, lots of feedback. And then we get into the work world and we're like, there's no regular feedback. There's no, milestones, et cetera, et cetera. And thinking that they have to have everything mapped out. So yeah, sharing, and this is something that one of the reasons why I love sharing with career coaching clients, especially the younger ones, stories of people's, circuitous paths to wherever they are now. It's like, yeah, it isn't a straight trajectory. You haven't got it all figured out, when you graduate or ever, really. It's always changing. Yeah. And then also to your point about it, like it gives people permission to acknowledge okay, I made a mistake and it isn't, and also it's not the end of the world. Look at the CEO did a big blooper early in their career or just last year, whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think then once people have started getting into the idea of telling their own story, then it's easier for them to start thinking about how they can use story in other ways that they communicate. So going back to the kind of strategy example again, often, and you'll have experienced this, everyone will have experienced this in organizations, when there's something new to announce, the CEO or whoever will arrange for everyone to get together, and then they'll deliver a PowerPoint presentation about this thing that they're doing, and then everyone goes away. And there might be some opportunities for questions, but most of the time everyone's bored and isn't listening, and then they wonder why no one's engaged in this new strategy. And so I think the work that I often do with leaders is to say, well, how can you build story into that process? So instead of standing up with a load of slides about this is where we are now and this is where we want to go, how can you build story into that? So you can think about the story you want to tell. It doesn't mean you can't use a presentation, but do it in a more storified way. But also, when you're trying to describe what this new world looks like, is there a way that you can do that in a way that's really engaging? So instead of just a load of facts about what's going to happen in the future, can you really build a picture for people? Get rid of some of that. We talked about uncertainty at the beginning. Can you get rid of some of that uncertainty and vagueness which goes around something new and make something far more tangible by really telling a story and painting a picture of where this organization is going?
Yeah, a couple of things related to that. I remember years ago in the States, there's a company called Zingerman's Deli that originally was just a local deli, and I think it's Wisconsin, but they became so legendary for their service and I'm sure their product that they became this national company, mail order, et cetera. And because they were so great, and Ari, I can't remember Ari's last name, is either the founder or the co-founder, they became so legendary for creating great culture that they also do training for leaders on how to create great culture. And one of the things that he did that I loved was, and I don't know if he coined this term or somebody else did, but he called them future stories. And so I think he wrote like a manifesto in the early days of this is what it's going to be like as a customer at Zingerman's Deli. And so telling stories of what that vision looks like. So I'll give you, this isn't what he said, but to give you an example, when somebody walks in the door, it isn't just the aromas of fresh bread and cheese. When they look at the counter, they see a smiling face. And when they place their order, that person remembers their name and asks about, that sort of thing. So it paints a picture. Mm-hmm. I think also, though, what makes it even more, to me, compelling is when you connect the present with the future.
Yes.
And so sharing stories of the present of people embodying what that vision looks like. Like, so for instance, Ginny, who's just a rock star of a counter clerk, whatever the title is, just last week, and then telling the story of how Ginny wowed the customer. So you think about it, it makes it more concrete in like a virtual reality training video. And it's also saying, like, you've got this, you can do this because you've already done this.
And that is such an important point, because often in change, there's this desire to constantly move forward, to get rid of everything in the past and start again. But actually, that isn't the right way to go about it, in my view, because there will have been a lot of good practice that took place in the past. And by getting rid of it all, you're basically saying to the people who already work there, well, everything you've done so far has been rubbish and we're going to start again. And you can't then expect people to be engaged in this new future, I think, if you're rubbishing everything they did before. But also appreciative inquiry, which is the space that I work from most of the time. A big part of that is about taking the best of what is and taking it forward. And there's loads of research out there to show that you'll be far more successful in doing something new if people can see how it tracks along with stuff that they valued in the past. So I think that's really important. I love the idea that there's a deli owner who's come up with all this wisdom and is now sharing it with the world. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, he's a really cool guy. And also I love that about what you've done is not it's not rubbish. Is also, you think about one of the biggest sources of resistance to change is the fear of, like, can we do this? Like, oh, it just seems so big and challenging. If you can remind people, like, you've done bits and pieces of this in the past, it's like, oh, right, okay. Mm-hmm. And also it kind of harkens back to one of the disciplines I love so much is the whole neuroscience and mind-body medicine field, the intersection of that, and how one's emotional state profoundly affects their perception of challenge. And so if people are reminded of, like, hey, you did this really well, or you overcame this challenge. Remember our team? We had that big, technology changeover, and it was difficult, but we got through it, and now life is so much better. By telling those stories and people remembering, like, oh yeah, we've done this sort of thing, it shifts them into a more empowered state so that they see this upcoming change in a much more manageable way versus all the adversity and the obstacles ahead.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that's key there, if you are talking about stories from the past, in fact, any story, it needs to have an element of uncertainty, things going wrong. If you think about the story arc from films, there's always a bit in it where, if you're quite sure, are they going to be successful? Is the hero going to win? And I think often the mistake that leaders make when they're trying to paint a picture of the future, they don't acknowledge the stuff that might go wrong, or the stuff that may have gone wrong in the past but was resolved. And they paint a positive picture. But if it's too positive, people don't believe that it's true. So I think you have to have that element of reality, jeopardy, things that might go wrong, but we've got plans in place to deal with it, for people to really agree with the story and see that it reflects what reality might be like.
Boy, that's a really good point. So it doesn't sound like this fantasy world that's never going to happen. Exactly.
Because I think there's a temptation during periods of uncertainty for leaders to parent the people in the organization by making them feel that everything's okay, everything's going to be fine. There's a worry that, oh, what if they realize how bad things are? But actually, I think there's a space for honesty here, about there's difficult times ahead, but we will get through it because we've done it before. Your point before. And so I think to resist the temptation of telling a fairy tale and actually tell a story that is true and reflects reality and reflects the difficulties that are ahead, because let's face it, everyone in organizations are adults. They should be treated like adults rather than treated like children, because if you treat them like children, then childlike behaviors might then be exhibited.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, ain't that the truth? Boy, and you're mentioning about not like doing a fairy tale, it's got to be honest. This is and how that you think about how that creates a lack of trust. It's like our leaders either they're knowingly lying to us or they're clueless. And actually, let me give you a quick example of using a story, and it's like super short story, as a way to foster insight in a leader. And so this still blows my mind. So this happened to me. So I worked in an organization where I headed up a training department, and it was actually a call center, an insurance company. And so it was like a customer care call center. And anybody who's ever managed a call center knows that's a hard gig. Call center work is a grind. And one of the things that I and my team wanted to do was to create some training around stress management and resilience. My boss's boss refused to allow us to talk about stress because she said that if we brought up the topic of stress, the call center reps would start thinking that they're stressed.
Okay.
And we don't want them to start thinking they're stressed. And I'm thinking, like, are you insane? And it's like, you think they don't recognize, because they're doing this job day in and day out. It's emotionally demanding. And so why am I bringing that up? I'm bringing it up for a couple of reasons. So one is it's a way of sharing a story. So it's about some other leader where I'm saying, like, you can tell it. I'll say, because I'm the one who told it, that I can really be like, are you kidding? And very confrontational about that person, but not the audience. And so if like there are leaders in the audience who are really out of touch or think they can put, there's a saying, I don't know if it's a saying in the States, but put a shine on a sneaker. It's a funny, I love this saying. Or there's put lipstick on a pig. That's yes. Another home. Yeah. That, like, you think people aren't noticing the stuff that you're trying to pretend isn't there. Like, are you insane? And so I wouldn't say that directly to whether it's an individual or a group, like that's kind of in your face, but I can say it about, I'm thinking about this, my boss's boss. And so because it's just a story, like as we've talked about in other, videos, et cetera, a person can hear it and reflect on it without having to defend it because it's not directly challenging them.
Exactly. And it immediately gets over that resistance that you might have to that message, because they can sit and listen to the story and think, oh, that's not me. But then actually, if they reflect, they might think, oh, actually, that is me.
Now that I think about it. Yeah. And so back to that. So that's an example of a retrospective story, something that happened to me years ago. Here's something for leaders to do. And this is, do you know how certain articles stand out for you years later? And like most of them are a blur. I remember this article from the 90s from Fast Company. And it was an article about a gentleman named Lee Hawk, who took this struggling organization and turned it into Visa.
Okay.
So, it's everywhere you want to be, or whatever their tagline is, D Hawk. And the article was about his approach to leadership. And then there was a sidebar, and I loved what it said. It said Lee Hawk's short course in leadership. And it says something like this: think of all the rude, disrespectful, annoying things that bosses did to you and don't do them. I thought, man, that's fantastic. And so that's a huge source of material for leaders at any level. And not only to guide their own behavior, but also back to teachable moments when they're coaching up and coming leaders for them, like, hey, here's something that really impacted me. And then using those, not just as like, here, let me tell you about this, but as a launching off point for the person you're coaching and mentoring to recall their own versions, either of them being on the receiving end of that or maybe them doing that.
And I think that's a really interesting point, because there you're telling a story about something that you've read. It's not something that's happened to you particularly, but you're telling a story and painting a picture about this thing that you read, and then using that as a lesson, a teachable moment, as you say. And I think it's really interesting to think about stuff that you've read that's stuck with you and why, but then making use of that in your work. So I always think what started me off down this road of storytelling was an article that someone gave me by Robert McKee, which was called Stories That Move People. And it was about screenwriting. I mean, this must have been back in 2008. And I think the article was way before then. It was probably in the 90s, from the Harvard Business Review. And it really stuck with me because it was about the effect of stories on the brain and how people engage more with a story than with something else. And it stuck with me. It was like niggling away at me for years and years until I actually did something with it. But there was something about that was interesting to me. And then I started talking about it and using it and telling people the story of how I'd read it in my own work. And I think that's the thing. If you want to tell a story, it doesn't necessarily need to be something that's happened to you. It could be something you've read or something you've seen or a film or something that happened to somebody else that they told you about. You don't need to be limited to your own life experience. I think as long as you make it clear that this may not have happened to you. I think you told me a story once where you were at a conference and someone told a story that had happened to them, and then it became obvious that it hadn't. Was that you?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, talk about destroying credibility. I'm glad you brought that up in terms of stories from things that you read. That is an amazing source of fantastic stories, including today's world of podcasts, things you hear. Actually, here's a really great example of taking a story from one domain and applying it to another domain. In this case, the world of medicine, and applying it to leadership. Mm-hmm. And so it was actually in one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, it probably was Blink, where he talked about fascinating research on physicians who got sued and those who didn't. And check this out for incredibly fascinating, where researchers took audio clips from 20-second conversations with physicians and patients. And what they did is they put the conversation through a filter that filtered out the frequency that conveyed words. So all you could hear was voice tone.
Oh.
You couldn't hear the words, just the voice tone. And researchers could predict with, I think it was something like 95 or higher % accuracy, who got sued and who didn't, just by voice tone.
That's amazing.
Isn't it? And check this out. And I love this. And I'm going to give you a story that Malcolm Gladwell, as you know, is like great at stories. One of the other things they found, and I'll tell you what the two factors were about who got sued.
Okay.
What they found was it had nothing to do with competence. In fact, there's this great story. So Malcolm Gladwell was so fascinated by the research. He interviewed a malpractice attorney to find out, like, does this, bear out? And she goes, absolutely. She said, I've never had a client sue a doctor they liked. And she said, in fact, just last week, I had a client who said that they wanted to sue, I think it was like the radiologist. And I said to her, like, it really looks like the error was in your primary care physician. And my client goes, I could never sue Dr. Jones. She's so nice to me. But that radiologist was a jerk or something like that. And it's like, so it has nothing to do with rationality. And so check this out. What they found was when voice tone communicated dominance and indifference, that was the kiss of death. And so so that's an example of sharing something I read along with a little story and using that as hopefully thought-provoking material in the workplace, because you think about, so we've been talking about change. How often have you heard leaders say, hey, it is what it is. They just got to deal with it. And it's like, you can say that and have that attitude, but look at what the research shows, that having that attitude of dominance and indifference triggers retaliatory behavior. And actually, here's one other little bit of something that you read and how you can apply it, like in another field, into the workplace. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it was in Blink too, but maybe it was someplace else, is reading that this anthropologist named Daniel Brown, but not the Da Vinci Code Daniel Brown. He wrote this book called Universals, and he wanted to find out, are there universal values regardless of the culture? And he identified several hundred, but 2 were justice and retribution. Mm-hmm. And so in the malpractice situation, when patients felt treated unfairly, they sought retribution. And you think about, and that's hardwired into the human psyche. And so you think about back to the workplace. If employees don't feel respected, if they feel like this change is unfair, or this, whatever way they're treated, it's human nature to find ways of doing payback. And it doesn't mean like planting malware in the company's software system, but it could simply be like the quote quiet quitting that we're hearing so much about. It could be about not offering the idea about how to make the rollout work better, because like, hey, they don't listen to us, so they didn't care about the rollout, how it's affecting us. So those are a couple examples, like to your point, of fascinating stuff that you read. It's like thinking about how can I apply this to coaching or my leadership message?
And it brings things to life, doesn't it? So instead of just telling somebody this is what you need to be doing or whatever, using that other information, whether that's from something that's happened to you or something you've read or something you've heard, it just brings it to life. And actually, while you were sharing that really fascinating research, which I'm going to have to look up because it's just amazing, doesn't that also tell us something about how leaders should be delivering messages? We've talked about sharing stories about change or sharing new strategies and using stories, but actually there's more to it than just the structure. You need to be thinking about your own delivery and how, because it's a performative act, all of this, isn't it? And no matter, people don't like to think of it, but a leader standing up on stage and sharing a vision or a strategy is a performance. And so they need to be thinking about how they perform and how they deliver. And that's tone of voice, that's the content, that's body language, it's everything. But they need to be thinking about that in advance.
Absolutely. And I do think, even though, when we started out, I brought back the conversation between you and Angus about not being a raconteur, that I think there is the conversation between, you don't have to be a stage performer or like a Shakespearean actor kind of thing. And the flip side, though, is it is an art. I feel like in some ways I'm arguing both sides. Like, everybody tells stories. Like, you go on a great holiday and like you tell what happened. When you shared with me about what are those games that you volunteered at?
Oh, the Commonwealth Games. Yeah.
Commonwealth Games. Yeah. So that was like super cool when you're talking about like what that was like and what you did. So everybody tells stories. Yeah. So it's not like, oh, I don't know how to do that. That being said, there's ways of doing it that make it come alive. And also, one of the big things that I see with people is being more intentional. Like, why am I telling this story? And what would be a good story that illustrates this, whatever this is? So that is where coaching for storytelling is really valuable.
And I think you're right. It's about doing it in a way that's authentic to you, and that feels authentic. But I also think it's about practice. So whenever I'm working with leaders, I often say, you're not going to be great at this from the beginning if you've never done it before, but just keep practicing and write it down. If you want to tell a story about where you got to where you are now, write it first and then practice saying it. If you want to tell a story about the strategy, write it down and then practice saying it, but write it in the way that you're going to speak it. And then speak it. But also there's other things to think about, isn't there? So I've just recently started thinking about visual storytelling and using that. And there's a great book called Presentation Zen, which I was introduced to, which I love. You'll know it. But if you do have to give a presentation, think about what you're going to have around you. So not just what you say, but what's going to be, if you have any slides, what's going to be on them. And my preference since reading that book is either not to use slides at all, or to just have a picture of something and then I talk to the picture. So it's all these things that you can think about just to build something different into the way that you communicate.
Yes. Yeah. That's such a beautiful book, isn't it? Isn't it? And that definitely transformed my approach. So same thing. I mostly do minimalist slides, like a picture, evocative picture that illustrates the point.
And I had Phil Waitnell on my podcast as well, and he his book is about the business presentation revolution, and it's got kind of 5 steps in it, which you can use to build storytelling into your presentation. So I definitely recommend either his book or listen to the podcast, because he very generously went through the stages in the book on the podcast.
Oh, neat. I'm definitely going to check that out.
Yeah, it's thinking more consciously. I think you said the point earlier, it's being more conscious of noticing what's going on around you, listening, but also thinking about more consciously about what you want to say and how you're going to say it.
Absolutely. And that's the 2 areas. And then I want to get back to the noticing piece. The 2 areas that I see people needing a lot of work on is being more intentional. And then number 2, adding details that make the story come alive versus getting mired in the weeds of details that don't move things forward. So I think that's important for people to think. When you talk about pay attention, in earlier when we were talking about being on the lookout for things that are happening, like, ooh, this could be a useful story. It makes me think of, and also being vulnerable as a way to foster that in others. So one of the stories that I share if I'm working with supervisors or managers is one of my mistakes as a supervisor, and how I caught myself only commenting on when my team needed to tweak something to make it a little better. And I thought, like, look what you're doing. Like, you're coaching people to catch people doing things right. And all you're doing is pointing out the areas that need to be improved on because your team is so great. You're taking for granted all the great things that they're doing right. And I use that as an example. So, a self-deprecating story, like, hey, we all do this. But I also, one of the points that I try to make in sharing that story is the reason why I did that, why I was doing that, is because, and I know you know this, the human brain is hardwired for negativity bias. The human brain is hardwired to notice what's wrong and what's bad and remember that, because the human brain is hardwired for survival, and what's wrong and bad could kill you.
Yes.
Back in caveman, cavewoman days. And so it takes mindfulness and thoughtfulness to override that hardwired tendency. So that's an example of like noticing something that I did wrong, and then carrying it forward to make the point in teaching and coaching supervisors, managers, leaders in the future to notice them doing it. And also, because it's me doing the blooper, it takes away some of that like power, like, oh, I'm the expert and I've got it all figured out. It's like, au contraire, like not at all. We're all figuring this out as we go along.
And I think that takes us back to where we started, this current environment that we're in of uncertainty and difficulty and in people's personal lives, which is translating into a feeling of exhaustion, I think, of when they're at work. And I think there's a real place now for leaders to be using storytelling to help people through that environment, to give people comfort that, they're not in this alone, to help provide some certainty to the uncertainty. So it feels like now is a really good time for leaders to be branching out into this type of experience and skill.
Yeah, thank you for looping us back to where we started. So yeah, a couple of like next steps for leaders to address that. So number one, we've talked about one of the next steps. So you've mentioned about the uncertainty. And so one of, as I know, one of the biggest roles of leadership is to help to create some sense of clarity and certainty in the midst of uncertainty. So that's where the future story comes into play. Like, paint that picture of what the vision looks like and why it's a good thing. So that's number one. Or actually, number one is what we talked about, actually listening to people and what's it like for them, what are their fears, et cetera, because that will shape your future story. And hearkening back to good old Angus Fletcher, I loved when he talked about storytelling through the ages was a very iterative process. So storytellers would notice the response from the audience and tweak their story. Well, in this case, leaders need to inform their stories. Like, what will be relevant to tell? What are the fears? What are the potential obstacles that they anticipate? That needs to be folded into like how they share the story. So number one, listening. Number two, what's the future story look like and sound like? Number three is what I call if we could handle that, we can handle this story, or I didn't think I could, but I did, or we didn't think we could, but we did stories, where you're sharing stories both of individuals overcoming big challenges and or hopefully within the organization, like remember the time during the big recession in 2008 and we blah, 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 blah. And this is what happened because of it. Mm-hmm. So sharing those stories, really important. And then kind of back to your things that you read about point, sharing stories, and there's like, you know, all kinds of videos now, good old YouTube and other places of all the amazing things that people have overcome during hard times, including like I'll just do workplace specific, the companies that were formed during major recessions and depressions, mm-hmm. and reminding people that, you know, what's possible during hard times. And again, back to the mind-body connection, if people feel that sense of like, oh yeah, it is possible because others have done it, it shifts their emotional state, which again, literally shifts their perspective and perception of this challenge ahead of us.
I love that. What a great way to finish off. Is a nice list of top tips for leaders to take away with them. I think for me, my advice would be just to give it a go. You know, we've talked a lot about learning and coaching and getting better at this, but you have to start somewhere. And I think to have a go, no matter how small, test it out, see how it works. I thank you for the point about the iterative story, because I think that idea of co-creation of story is really important. That, you know, it shouldn't just be one story, it should be the story of many. So I would encourage anyone watching this to just get out there and have a go at storytelling and enjoy it. It's fun.
Oh, it's unbelievably fun. And it makes communication more fun and it makes life more fun, because once you start, so like Angus talks about story thinking, the more you have like story thinking in everyday life, the more like simple, seemingly mundane moments become infused with meaning and possibility. Because like, oh, wow, that little thing that just happened, like I could use this at a cool teaching story.
Exactly. It once you get into that mindset, it changes the way that you approach everything. It's a bit like you read about novelists, don't you? And they take things from everyday life, and then all their friends and family get nervous because they think they're going to start writing about them.
I love it. That's awesome. But yeah, and at the risk of belaboring or prolonging the takeaways, when you said just give it a go and practice, is kind of related to that, is just notice when you're telling stories. Mm-hmm. It's like you're already doing it. You can do this because you're already doing it. Exactly.
David, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, as always, talking to you.
Oh, thank you. It is. It's such a blast.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Change Stories podcast. I love this conversation and I hope you did too. Thanks as ever to my wonderful guests and to Pete Morgan at Monkey Pants Productions for making the podcast sound amazing. If you want to find out more about this or any other episodes of Change Stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk, where you will find all the episodes and show notes. If you have enjoyed listening, please rate and review the Change Stories podcast on your podcast listening platform. And do please let me know if you have ideas or requests for future episodes. You can contact me and find out more about change and storytelling on my website, www.feldsparconsulting.com. Thanks again for joining in with the Change Stories conversation.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.